next speaker will be Lou Guzzo, who will talk about how to get our message to the media.
Why do I have this sudden urge to call my broker and tell him to sell? He can. I hope he's there tomorrow. Well, we heard earlier about it was buried 15 feet deep down. Pretty nice guy or something like that. You go 5 feet further down and you come to journalists. A wicked journalist, of which I am one, and I confess, for almost 60 years. Yeah, I'm older than I look. Well, the good news is that I don't have any slides. The bad news is I'm going to speak anyway. Thank you, Mom. I'm truly honored to address so distinguished an audience as this. It isn't very often that I get this caliber of IQ to talk up to. As my longtime friend and associate, the late and the most remarkable Dr. Dixie Lee Ray would have said had she been here, and I know she talked to this group many times. If she were here, she would say, "These are my people." Well, let me go a little further. You're not only her people, you're mine too. You and others who revere honest science and truth. You really are the hope of all people in America and really the protectors of all the freedoms spelled out by our forefathers 2 centuries ago. The nation needs all of you, everybody in this room, and everybody like you, and all of those who share your beliefs. More urgently today, I think, than at any time in the past 200 years. Ask yourself, are you prepared to accept the challenge that the situation offers? I certainly hope so. Am I exaggerating the crisis? Let me refer once more to that inspired handiwork of those framers of the Constitution and cite what I believe is the cornerstone of our democratic republic, the First Amendment to the Constitution, and its guarantee of freedom of the press. Revered words, aren't they? Truly are. Freedom of the press. We say them trippingly on the tongue, as if the mere mention assures us that they are alive and well and safe. But are they? Do we actually have freedom of the press in America today? I invite you to read, for starters, the book titled Watching America by the doctoral threesome of Robert and Linda Lichter and Stanley Rothman, referred to by other speakers, by the way. In their authoritative and well-researched study, they indicate that the news media in general and television in particular are free, as in free press, only if you happen to espouse very liberal or ultra-liberal beliefs. Now listen to this, and I quote unashamedly from Environmental Overkill by Dr. Dixie Lee Ray and myself regarding Watching America. Their profound, well-researched scientific study of the manner in which television has manipulated programs to suit the political and social beliefs of producers, editors, writers, and staff is an alarming revelation. And I'm still quoting. The authors found, for example, that at least 3/4 of the creative leaders in TV acknowledge that they are liberals and vote Democratic without fail. 2/3 of them believe the structure of American society is faulty and must be changed, as they would change it. 97% say women alone should have the right to decide whether they want to have an abortion. 80% believe that there is nothing wrong with homosexual relations, and 51% see nothing wrong with adultery. Most significant, the TV people surveyed admit they work their ideas on social reform, mores, the environment, and other issues into the programs that they create for their audiences. That's the end of that quote. There's much more worth reading in that book. Now, they're not alone. Several other studies support the findings of the Lichters and Rothman and reveal that the statistics are similar for newspapers, radio, and the news magazines. Now, as you might have guessed, I don't need all these studies to discover that ultraliberalism, or just plain liberalism, has taken over the once free American press. I've lived it through more than 55 years in the print and the broadcast media. And I can tell you that the Lichter-Rothman estimate that 3/4 of the media are professed liberals is much too conservative, if you'll pardon my use of that term in this context. In fact, I would guess that the number is closer to 90%, if not over. In addition, I would observe that the liberalism of today is not the same as the liberalism of 40 and 50 years ago. It is better defined, I think, and this is the way I define it, as socialism, in effect, or a welfare state, if you prefer. Now, if I have alarmed you about the menace within the news media of today, good. But let me alarm you even more. It has become quite obvious that the major news carrier of the 21st century, and we're almost there, will be the internet and the denizens of Cybernia, to coin a phrase. That in itself should not be alarming, but you may have discerned, as I have, by now, that many or perhaps most of the moguls who control the software and the hardware industries and the multimedia resources are of the very strong liberal stripe. It may be a case of leaping from the frying pan into the fire. Now, why do I make so much of this issue? Because, I say, the news media are virtually the only watchdog that we have to inform us of wrongdoing, to investigate corrupt practices wherever they may be, and to combat that constant enemy of freedom, secrecy in and outside government. As we have seen too often, we cannot depend upon Congress, as they just recently proved and are proving, the 50 legislatures, and the county and city councils to investigate and expose criminal practices. I hope you understand my predicament, and yours as well, really. You should know that I am, on one hand, one of the strongest defenders of the press, what the press really should mean, that you'll find anywhere. And on the other hand, I am one of the greatest critics of the press you will find anywhere. And I see no conflict in being both. Let me tell you, too, from experience, that there is absolutely no conspiracy, at least I haven't discerned one, no conspiracy truly among newsmen and women to take control of the nation. If there were, it would be far easier to solve the problem because they would not any longer have a disguise. No, unfortunately, liberal reporters, editors, anchor people, and the others earnestly believe what they write and say, and they are not aware that they are espousing socialist dogma. That makes a solution extremely more difficult. Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right in assigning a very lofty position in our society to the press. But he must be turning over in his grave like a pig on a spit. But he must be turning over because the media themselves have corrupted that position by failing to fulfill the responsibility placed in them by the First Amendment. All too often in recent times, the media have been derelict in what they have not done, even more perhaps than what they have done. You can see what they've done. That's easy to zero in on. But they have not done, and to me this is the greatest crime within the media, all the media, press, print. Let me give you a very startling example that I know you're very well acquainted with. I believe 1996 was one of the worst years in the history of American journalism. A president seeking re-election was charged, mind you, not officially, but charged in publications, radio, television, charged by people, talk shows, whatever, charged with a remarkable list of misdeeds, supposed misdeeds. Congress itself botched the potential investigations for fear, I think, and for the most part, of having its own improprieties discovered. Law enforcement agencies from Arkansas to Washington, D.C., and all routes thereto, were unwilling or afraid for political reasons to dig deeply into all of those charges. It was the right time, it should have been the right time for the news media to do their jobs, to do the investigating for the people's sake. They blew it. What happened? Nothing. Because journalists everywhere, predominantly liberal and admittedly democratic with a capital D, yawned and refused to consider that a Democratic president could do anything wrong. Now let's be fair and circumspect about this. We didn't know in 1996, and we still don't know, whether the myriad charges were true or had some substance or none to all of them. But they were very serious and alarming. If the charges that I have read and heard, and that's virtually all of them, had in fact been true, then we should have impeached the president. But if they were not true, and if all of these charges, wherever they appeared, were not true and could be so substantiated, then those making those charges, on the other hand, should have gone to jail or worse, or fined or whatever. Thanks, Mom. Let's listen to some of these charges, and these are just a few of them that were leveled against Bill and Hillary Clinton, as if you didn't know. Illegal favors to foreign sources in return for enormous political contributions and outright bribes. Similar deals with various firms, again in return for cash donations. These are still charges, mind you. White House privileges to generous political donors and turning the White House into a bed and breakfast. Illegal use of hundreds of personal FBI files for political purposes. This, to me, is still the most serious of all the charges. Again, a variety of improper and illegal deals made by Clinton cabinet officers, including a nice arrangement for Webster Hubbell and friends. And worst of all, a charge that Clinton, I don't know whether you've read about some of these things in the underground press, a charge that Clinton was somehow responsible for the disappearance or death, even murder, of several persons who got in his way en route to political power. Now, that's pretty serious stuff. I don't know whether it's true, but it has been said to be true, and it's there in black and white. You invest, if you're an honest journalist, and you have the means of investigating, you investigate all this stuff. Now, I haven't even mentioned the numerous sexual escapades. Were they truth or lies? Next to the other stuff, the sex incidents don't impress me at all. It doesn't matter, really, which side of the controversy you may be on, as I said. You and others in this country should have demanded that the news media investigate them for what they were worth. And, as I said, take care of those who make false charges. That's the nature of freedom in America, and it's guaranteed by our Constitution. Now, that obviously should have been the function of the news media, but through their inaction, they failed their responsibility and thereby mocked the notion that our nation is protected by a free press. Let's shift scenarios for just a moment. With a press this deficient and so strongly inclined to all things liberal, what has happened to the cause of honest science, technology, and environmental issues? All of you know the answer to that, I guess. Let me provide an answer from my long experience in the media. Thanks to the welfare state legacy inherited from the New Deal and the Great Society, the present generations of reporters, editors, and TV anchors have been successfully brainwashed by ultra-liberal and liberal politicians, educators, and particularly the extreme environmental organizations, which themselves should be investigated. And I wonder why they're not. Under these conditions, let's say, for example, that another Chicken Little handout or press release emanates from Greenpeace, Earth First, Friends of the Earth, and a variety of others, or some crackpot organization sponsored by the United Nations, and there are plenty of those. Following the schedule of myths and popular inventions, a press release or handout may say the ozone hole is larger than ever, global warming is just around the corner, or nuclear wastes are about to explode and destroy the planet. You know, the usual stuff. What does today's reporter do? Well, he reaches for his Rolodex, of course, to check the validity of the handout with one of his sources. And I've looked through a lot of these Rolodexes, believe me, as an editor and an executive editor. And who are the sources in the Rolodex? Only the loud-mouthed, publicity-seeking Chicken Littles like Maurice Strong, Lester Brown, Paul Ehrlich, Ralph Nader, Barry Commoner, and those two eminent scientists, Jane Fonda and Meryl Streep. And this guy is another one that we should be following, Reed Irvine. I've read his material for a long time. And oh yes, in addition to Streep and Fonda, I mustn't forget, and I wouldn't, His Eminence Al Gore, Vice President of the United States. Now, I've read his book. I had to read it several times, because I reviewed it in Environmental Overkill. Dixie refused to look at it. So I reviewed it at any rate. The only balance in his book is in the title, Earth in the Balance. Now, missing from the reporter's Rolodex are the legitimate and quiet-spoken sources, those sources who seldom or never get asked by the media about issues in their field of research. Hugh Elsasser. Do they ever ask Hugh? Pat Michaels. Bob Ballong. Well, I think he may be here or has been. Edward Krug. Fred Singer, Elizabeth Whalen, Julian Simon, Bernard Cohen, who is here, that magnificent man whom I revere as a scientist and as a human being. Do they ever ask him? I'm going to ask him later myself. Do you ever get any phone calls from the media? I doubt it. But he ought to be the first one they call when things nuclear are the order of the day. There are so many others in addition to Bernard Cohen, Dr. Cohen. Bruce Ames, Ed Teller, Bob Jastrow, from whom you've heard today, and you're going to hear from another, Jane Orient, Frederick Seitz, and Art Robinson, one of the best minds in America today. Sally Baliunas, you've heard from her, magnificent. And so many more like them, and others in this room whom I haven't mentioned. I could read the roster of this conference, and it would be appropriate to this paragraph. And among the honest environmental writers and journalists, there are some of them honest. Ron Bailey, I don't know if you know Ron or have read his books. Michael Bennett, Michelle Malkin, Michael Fumento, William Perry Pendley. And, oh, what the heck, I'll throw in Lou Guzzo, if you don't mind. And why aren't these voices heard? Of course, the first reason is that the brainwashed reporter isn't interested in these reputable voices because their cautious approach to scientific issues just might ruin a good, sensational story. Where have we heard that before? I used to work for William Randolph Hearst's newspapers. I know what I'm talking about here. The second reason is the crux of the message I am anxious to convey to you today. It is that the legitimate, honest, dedicated scientist shies away from controversy, from the limelight, and from the press in general. Remember, what was it? Yes, just earlier today, a doctor came and reported that he'd asked Enrico Fermi whether he would speak on an issue, and Fermi said, "Oh, no, I never get involved." Good example. For 2 years back in the early 70s, I served Dr. Ray and the Atomic Energy Commission as a communications consultant. Dixie and I were deeply disturbed by the criticism that the AEC and the entire nuclear complex, the industry itself, were far too secretive about things nuclear. Together, we resolved to open up the agency and the industry to public scrutiny, being careful, of course, to protect proprietary information. Now, at her bidding, I embarked on a tour, took about 2 years, of all the nuclear installations in the U.S., after which I wrote up a report. These were extensive interviews everywhere. I wrote the report with many recommendations to her for letting the public and the press in on a once totally secret agency and industry. I think it was one of the best things I've ever done. I've never worked harder on anything. The best things I've ever done as a communicator. But unfortunately, Congress, in its own hysterical distrust of anything nuclear, abolished the vital, efficient AEC, which was probably the finest governmental agency ever conceived, and replaced it with a sort of laughable and ineffective Department of Energy. There was no voice any longer for this marvelous new technology, nuclear science. My report and recommendations, as a result, lie gathering dust on a shelf somewhere in Washington, D.C. I don't know, maybe it deserves it, but I don't think so. But that's another story. I brought it up here because of what I encountered in my interviews of all those scientists and engineers at all of these installations. These men and women were remarkably impressive to me and very cooperative until I asked the following question. When you read or hear about a ridiculous, unscientific charge against the nuclear industry or nuclear physicists, why don't you issue a public statement setting things right and explaining that issue from the standpoint of good, honest science? Well, each time I asked that question, with very few exceptions, the scientists answered, "Oh, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved in a public debate. Our words would only be twisted anyway to the reporter's devices. That's not the role of the scientist." There, my friends, is the culprit. If you seriously wish to strike a blow for good, honest science, for an equal voice in the news media, and for the sake of America's future, you must get involved and counter these fraudulent activists with the truth. Who else is going to do it? To oversimplify it, you must simply get your names into those damned Rolodexes, if nothing else, so you'll be on call. I know it will work. As an example, I'm reminded of an incident some 20 years ago. Dr. Ray had been invited to address the American Society of Newspaper Editors, a group to which I had belonged for many years before I left to go to Washington. Now, as Dixie's speechwriter, as if she needed one, I was ecstatic over the chance to tell my one-time colleagues a thing or two about the coverage of nuclear and environmental issues, albeit through the voice of Dr. Ray. I think the speech was a humdinger. It was to be delivered to the convention on the old Queen Mary, up a few blocks here. The old Queen Mary, which has just been restructured into a resort hotel at California's Long Beach. When she arrived, Dr. Ray discovered to her horror that she was not the speaker as advertised, but a member of a panel. She hated panels. The three others on the panel included David Broder and two other worshipers of liberal speak, whose names I have forgotten, perhaps because I wanted to. She wanted to storm out of that room, and I had all I could do to placate her and tell her, "Dixie, sit down. You got to do your thing." As expected, she did. As expected, the three other gentlemen, and I say that word advisedly, the three other speakers said their piece, and each one of them berated science, technology, and opponents of the militant environmental movement. They received polite applause from the 450 to about 500 editors who were in attendance. And now it was Dixie's turn. Red with rage, and if you knew Dixie, when she got red with rage, she would look more like a tomato without not being on the vine. Red with rage, she stood up with my speech in one hand, and she said, and this is about the way she said it, "I have here," she said, "a tremendous speech on the glories of modern science and technology and the story the news media aren't telling the public. But I'm not going to read this speech here today. You'll find copies of it in the back of the room. And I ask you, please, to give it a good read. I recommend it to you highly. What I want to do instead," she says, glancing at these three renegades, "what I want to do instead is tell the other side, the truth about the issues the three speakers before me have mutilated with half-truths and outright lies." God, she had courage. She had taken notes all the time they were speaking, probably chewing on that pen like a dog on its biscuit. And she proceeded with extraordinary memory to recap what each person had said, dwelling most of the time on his nibs, David Broder, as you can imagine. And she provided scientific facts and figures I don't know where she got them, but this was her character. She had a remarkable memory. She remembered everything they said and more that they probably should have said or could have said. And she disproved every one of their contentions. She was truly in a fury. And her rapid-fire delivery electrified the editors. When she finished, the entire assemblage of editors rose as one and gave her a 5-minute ovation, to the deserved embarrassment of the three, the bewilderment of these three men on the panel, and particularly Mr. Bruder. So you see, it can be done. Okay, what can you do about this situation as individuals and as a group? I have a short-range proposal for you and a long-range proposal. First, the short-range suggestions. If you want to strike a blow for sanity and good science, take your message directly to the media, the TV station, the newspaper, and the radio station, but don't leave it in the hands or the lap of a reporter, the newsroom receptionist, or mail or fax it in, just as another of the hundreds of press releases that they throw away daily without reading anyway. Insist on delivering your personal message in person to the station manager, go right to the top, or the publisher, or at the very least the editorial board, news director, or managing editor. Second, in preparing your message, imagine that you are writing a scientific paper that requires facts, statistics, and good references. Don't be bashful. Your opponents are anything but that. Fire must be used to fight fire. Good science to combat bad science. And hard truth to banish lies and distortions. Now, 3, don't let any rash, unscientific scare stories go unchallenged. Write letters to the editor. I know that may sound like a picayunish thing to do, but believe me, they have a great impact on public perceptions. And you know darn well that the organized organizations who are your foes they're turning out those letters like in factory style. When a Nader, commoner, Ehrlich, Strong, Brown, or even Gore comes to town to distribute more scare story garbage, protest the experience and set things right, preferably while they're there. 4, join with other reputable scientists to take action en masse, so it will have clout. Now this may strike many of you scientists and physicists and doctors as something you really don't want to do. It's not really science, but believe me, it better be, because science will die of its own accord if it fails to protest. Don't be afraid to point an accusing finger, as Dixie did many times. Don't be afraid to do it at those so-called scientists who are willing to dodge an issue or even lie about it to protect a government or foundation grant or a cushy job. Now that's a tough one to do, but it's vital. The emphasis here is that there is strength in numbers of honest scientists. The lunatic fringe in the environmental movement operates that way, and so should you to counter it. If you can afford it, set up an informational 800 number for the press and the public and publicize it widely, and then invite anyone to call that number for reliable information or references on any issue in science, technology, and the environment. That could prove to have some great results. As 6, let me offer a partial agenda for additional action by this organization and any others to which you may belong of similar stripe. First, this bit of information that comes from experience. The news media have become lazy, paying attention only to the squeaky wheel. They no longer have the ambition to investigate, because investigation takes money, patience, and personnel. That's the reason they continue to overplay and emphasize crime news, which comes right off the police blotter or is handed out by law enforcement officers like candy kisses at a county fair. Okay, now to that agenda I referred to. My recommendations to you go this way. As a group, I would suggest that you mount a series of highly provocative challenges for all the media. For example, ask them why they have given the environmental extremist organizations a free pass, so to speak, and refuse to investigate their operations. Why, for example, have all but a few of them been granted tax-free status? Have you read 501c3 lately to see what it requires? You'll be astonished. Under 501c3 provisions, though these are provisions of the federal law, organizations that engage in political action try to influence legislation, work as lobbyists in effect, or manipulate issues to their own special advantage, financial or otherwise, should be denied tax-free status. That's one I hope you will work on. I am trying to do something with that one. The second on the agenda is, in less than half a century, going over just a few of these major issues. In less than half a century of use, DDT, the most successful insecticide and most amazing chemical that the world has produced, saved an estimated, and this may be a low figure, saved an estimated 100 million lives from insect-borne diseases. After militant environmental organizations inspired by Rachel Carson's terribly flawed Silent Spring forced gutless politicians to ban DDT in 1972, the death rate from those diseases has skyrocketed once more to more than 2 million a year from malaria alone. Now, you're a reporter, an investigative reporter. Shouldn't you and the rest of the media be investigating the deaths of 2 million people a year? If there was a murder on your front lawn, you certainly wouldn't have let it go. We're talking about millions of people. And whose fault is it? Shouldn't the media be investigating the fault, if nothing else? We know whose fault it is, don't we? Similarly, and this is three, why haven't the media looked into the deaths and the great property loss resulting from the ban on PCBs? By far the best fire retardant developed for use in electric transformers. Since their ban and replacement by mineral oil, and maybe you haven't noticed this, there has been a catastrophic rise in major transformer fires that have eliminated PCBs. And you know what these big fires can cost, not only in lives, but in property. Who's investigating it? I can't even get something done in Seattle, my hometown. I can't get the fire department interested. Why aren't the news media, this is fourth, why aren't the news media interested in investigating the ozone hole fable and the fact that the enforced elimination of CFCs from refrigerators, food storage facilities, air conditioners, firefighting procedures will cost the American people more than $1 trillion by the year 2000. While they're at it, why don't the media, this is 5, why don't the media listen to the hundreds of competent scientists who will tell them that global warming is still another environmental scam that will cost Americans trillions more? Now, I could offer many more suggestions like these. I haven't even mentioned NAPAP, but somebody else did before. That marvelous study, for a 10-year study, which at a cost of some $780 million, and the use of some of the finest scientific minds in the U.S., it was finally presented to Congress, And I have to go out now that I've gone into it. And those scientists, led by Ed Krug and Dr. Maloney, recommended to Congress that the acid rain problem was not truly a problem at all. All you had to do was spend about $500,000 a year or so to eliminate it or to control it. And yet Congress ignored that remarkable study, went ahead with the amendment to the Clean Air Act, and also earmarked $40 billion to create a system of eliminating acid rain that the scientists, good, reliable scientists, had said could be eliminated for about $500,000. Where the hell were the media on this story? Well, as I said, I could offer many more similar cases. But I need the time right now to get on with my long-range proposal, which is my primary target in this talk. The American news media need a major shakeup in their methods, in their operations, and their mission or focus. Thanks to 50 years of advancing socialism, the once sacred traditional division of news and opinion has been scrapped. The media are more interested in making or shaping the news than reporting it honestly, accurately, and without prejudice. Not only do news reporters inject their own opinion into their reports, they and their editors or producers frequently ignore coverage of the other side in controversial issues, the side with which they don't agree. Or worse yet, with the Clinton issues, the ones I've already mentioned, the media simply ignore the news altogether, or bury it in an obscure page inside the newspaper or among the quick briefs in the news broadcast, sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning. You'd know what I mean if you were at the daily news conferences that I've had to attend over the years to decide, those conferences decide which events are to be covered and which reporters would be best equipped to handle the assignments. There's skullduggery there too, because then the brainwashed editors have a chance either to eliminate the stories they don't want to have covered, or assign somebody who is bound to come back with a story the editor can accept. That's deep. I could go into that, but much more detail if you request someday. Furthermore, an arrogance has gradually crept into newsrooms everywhere. Editors, producers, and reporters expect everyone else, like you, that is everyone, to conform, expect all of these people to conform to rigid rules of excellence and behavior. That is, they expect everybody else to adhere but themselves. No rules can or should apply to them, they say, because they are the free press, aren't they? I believe the gathering and reporting of the news should be considered, and don't be shocked, should be considered a science. My experience tells me that it is most assuredly not an art form. Journalism, as I learned its fundamentals many years ago, is an exact science when it is practiced properly and without prejudice. The who, what, why, when, and where of reporting the news are definitive and should not be open to interpretation. The interpretation, if any, belongs in the clearly marked opinion columns and the editorial pages in TV and radio. And in TV and radio, of course, they should be identified as opinion. Not only should journalism be treated and taught as a science, it should be required to adhere to a code of ethics and behavior. And why not? Doctors live by a centuries-old code, and lawyers by canons. And so do other professionals. Why shouldn't the media people? Who is to blame for the present journalistic jungle? Well, the reporters, editors, anchors, and producers, in part, of course. to some degree, we'll say. But I would, and I may shock you with this, but I would place the major blame at the very top, where it belongs. It should be in the best, it should be, I say, in the best interest of publishers, station owners, and boards of directors to clean house and de-opinionate the news. Ironically, most of them deplore the ultra-liberal distortions practiced on the floors below them, but they are either afraid to intervene and set things right, or they are unaware that these distortions of the news are a daily occurrence. Of course, I am not including in that group of station owners, publishers, and so forth, who might listen to you. I am not including people like Ted Turner or even the Washington Post publisher. The people with closed minds. Now, I am positive, I told you I'd shock you. I am positive that you and other scientists of America, acting in concert, can put pressure on academia and the press and the news media, the ownerships of all the media, to apply the principles of good science to the practice of journalism and rebuild the wall that divides news from opinion in the print and broadcast media. In his exceptional newsletter, Access to Energy, Dr. Art Robinson, whom we all know so well, I remember this one very well. It was about 2 years ago, I think. He wrote about a scientist he knew, and I am embarrassed that I can't remember the name of the scientist. And I think Michael Monaris already referred to the same idea. Referred to a scientist and told a story about him. The scientist, and I'm paraphrasing Art, of course, said that after making an important discovery, his most important duty was to try proving himself wrong. What a marvelous definition. That's been applied to our inimitable Dr. Bernard Cohen already. What a marvelous definition that is of the true scientist. Now, if only the practice of journalism would learn to operate from the same spirit of discovery and devotion to truth. It could, but a lot of work needs to be done. You may know that one of the largest stumbling blocks in the training of skillful, unprejudiced journalists lies in the academic world itself, which is why all of you here are specially equipped to help change things. Most of the nation's communications and journalism colleges or departments teach activist reporting. That is, encouraging reporters to become part of the news, part of everything they cover, and to tell it from the standpoint of persons or activities being reported. Now, how do I know this? Well, I've taught news writing and other courses at 2 universities and lectured at several others. But even more important, as a managing editor, I interviewed many job applicants who came directly from college campuses, and I was astounded to hear their views on how news should be covered. While I was away from the PI office once, this was many years ago, my assistant hired a young reporter and put him on the police beat. It was the frantic 60s, late 60s, around 67, I guess. A few weeks after I returned, a mass protest against the Vietnam War broke out in downtown Seattle, and the police were there in full force. Well, needing all the hands we could get, we sent out a large contingent of photographers and reporters, including the newly hired rookie, to cover all of the violence downtown. Well, true to his collegiate training, the rookie fell in with the protesters and started throwing bricks through the store windows and pulling down signs and whatever else the protesters were doing. Well, afterward, I called him into my office and asked him why he did it. His reply was that it was important to become part of the protest so that he could get the proper feel of the story. You may have guessed that I fired him on the spot. However, I don't know whatever happened to him, but I wouldn't be surprised to find him in a high position with CNN, NBC, CBS, ABC, or even the New York Times. I forgot his name, Reed, so I can't help you with that one. Somehow, we must persuade the news media to quit relying on untrained or unqualified personnel to report the news in sophisticated fields, such as education, the sciences, medicine, the arts, and the environment. I remember Dr. Ray once complaining bitterly about newspaper book reviewers. A scientist, she said, scientist, engineer, or architect will devote 10 or 15 years or more of his life in research for a very important, highly technical book. And when it is published, the newspaper turns it over to a young dolt who got the job of book reviewer because nobody else wanted it. Well, what kind of a review can you expect from someone with all that experience? Unfortunately, she described the problem perfectly. The media's one-sided coverage has impacted all other avenues in our society, including the book industry, and especially education. A friend of mine went into Barnes & Noble and asked for a copy of Environmental Overkill. This was last year. Imagine I have a friend who hadn't read the book yet. He went into the store and he said to the clerk there, where can I find a copy of Environmental Overkill by Dixie Leroy and Lou Guzzo? Well, as you may know, Dr. Gray and I were very careful to make this one of the best researched and referenced books yet written on environmental issues. With a smirk and a twist on her lips, the young receptionist told my friend, "Oh, that book. You'll find it in the back of the store in the section marked fiction." I think I understand now why people commit murder. The news media owe it to viewers, listeners, and readers to hire the best qualified people that they can find to report the sophisticated news. But they don't do it because they don't want to pay for that talent. I'm surprised, for example, that America's psychiatrists and psychologists, for example, didn't complain a long time ago over the media's reliance on such unqualified people as Ann Landers and Abby and others to give advice to people with severe behavior problems. Now, these charlatans are not only unqualified, they are downright dangerous. Little wonder, I say, that doctors, scientists, engineers, and the like are extremely reluctant to talk to members of the press. But we've got to change that. In the early 70s, I wanted to get an increased budget from the publisher so I could hire a competent medical doctor to write a column and report health news from the doctor's standpoint. To strengthen my case, I canvassed a directory of all the daily and weekly newspapers in the U.S., some 17 or 1,800 of them. Horrors. I found only one newspaper with a doctor of medicine on its staff. And that was the New York Times, which can afford it. I don't think the situation has changed much, if at all, in the intervening years, but I know from that experience, and I know from my conscience, that the media have got to spend more money to hire people who understand the sciences, the technologies, the arts, and all the things they are expected to cover sensibly. Well, to sum up and to reiterate my contention that we are in a crisis that seriously impacts America's future, I am positive you and others like you can spark a movement to reconstitute the news media, and I would be willing to help you. I appeal to you to help persuade the media to bring back the tradition of reporting the news without slant or opinion, and to hire these well-qualified specialists to cover technical fields. You can do it if you band together, and you've got a good start on that, and are not afraid to speak out. There is much, much, much more at stake than meets the eye and the ear, and I still insist on calling it a crisis. I close with an example from history that I have related many times as a speaker, writer, and a teacher, and particularly to point up the imminent danger from the growing green menace, among others, and this march towards socialism. Permit me to paraphrase that gallant minister, Dr. Martin Niemöller, whose protest against Adolf Hitler landed the Reverend in jail, as all of you know. If he were here today before you in this august body, he very likely would deliver a warning that might go like this. They came for the farmers, and I didn't protest because I was not a farmer. Then they came for the factory workers and the carpenters, and I didn't protest because I wasn't a factory worker or a carpenter. Finally, they came for me and the other doctors and scientists, but by then there was no one left to protest. I think history can speak for itself. Many, many thanks for listening and for permitting me to talk to you today.